Okay, everyone, I think we'll get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to TBR's webcast, Telecom Infrastructure Services, Opportunities for Suppliers. My name is Arnie Tomeno. I'm the Director of the Networking and Mobility Practice here at TBR, and I will be your host for today's session. We are thrilled that you're able to join us today. In order to help you get the most out of today's session, I want to review a few housekeeping items. First, we will be recording today's session and posting it to the TBR YouTube channel, so if you'd like to watch the presentation again or pass it along to your colleagues. Second, this is an interactive session, so we encourage you to ask us any questions that arise during the webcast via the chat function. I will be collecting your questions throughout the session and posting them to our panel at the end of the presentation. Third, we will send out the slides to everyone registered for today's webcast within 24 hours of the conclusion of the presentation. Now, without further ado, let me introduce two key members of my team who will be presenting today. Michael Sullivan Trainer will begin today's session on Telecom Infrastructure Services. Michael is an executive analyst on our Networking and Mobility Practice team. Michael will drive through our market overview and key development sections, and then bring this to our market share section where Chris Antlitz, an analyst on the Networking and Mobility Practice team, will provide insights into the TIS supplier market share and drive this to the most profitable TIS supplier section. Chris will then give the reins back to Michael, who will wrap up the session with a quick overview of TBR's TIS research capabilities. I will now hand the presentation over to Michael Sullivan Trainer. Michael?
Thanks, Arnie. Welcome to those who have participated with us in the past on Telecom Infrastructure Services research deliveries, and welcome to those who are new to this. We'll be providing an introduction to our Telecom Infrastructure Services market model, which is a 5-year forecast of infrastructure services acquired by service providers, as well as highlighting some of the work done in our benchmarking of telecom infrastructure services. So the agenda for today's webinar is we will have a market overview highlighting the key developments in the telecom infrastructure services dynamics for service providers. We will look at the overall spend and then drill into the spend by a few of the key segments where we see the greatest opportunity for services and segments by geography, as well as highlight the most recent results from 2010 and the second quarter of market share by supplier, and highlight profitability by supplier, and close with some views of TBR's capabilities in this area and your questions. So first, we are going to look at the market overview. As many of you know, services is continuing to gain a larger share of the revenue for suppliers, and that's because it is a larger share of spend for operators. Operators, both mobile and fixed, as well as multi-service in most regions, see services as an engine for transformation and cost reduction that allows them to align with the new kinds of revenue models or the faster time to market demands that they have to operate with now, given competitive and economic and regulatory environments. Specifically, we see a series of key developments resulting from this new emphasis on services. The first one is that capacity build is certainly driving the market still at this time, both in terms of rollouts of mobile broadband in mature markets of LTE types of rollouts, as well as 3G rollouts in developing markets. This continues to be the underpinning of services which we categorize as product-attached services, largely maintenance and deployment-related services. Parallel to that, however, we see a growing interest in acquiring services for integration and transformation. It's creating a new traction for professional services. Professional services, as you'll see, encompasses a great number of different categories of service. In general, operators see tapping the suppliers, both IT and telecom professional services arms, to help them transform the underlying operating, the OSS or BSS systems, or integrating the new technology in order to achieve a superior way to monetize the capacity that they've been building out and continue to build out. The highlight geographically continues to be growth in India and China, where there is the most demand for reaching still new segments of the user population with services such as 3G. The waves of growth in India and China, particularly in recent years, continue to be quite strong, where there's been a drag on growth through the economics, particularly in EMEA, and as we all know, North America is in the midst of a capacity build-out despite the economic challenges. That sums up to say it's a productized services opportunity in those regions for the most part. We continue to see mobile broadband being a driver much more rapidly than fixed, largely because of the capacity build. Also, mobile operators are most aggressively trying to determine how to monetize their broadband, newly laid out broadband infrastructure. And we continue to see Tier 1 service providers be the dominant spend, although there is a growing share of spend by Tier 1 and Tier 2 service providers. And as we'll highlight in our supplier section, market share leadership continues to remain with Ericsson by virtue of its broad portfolio and its geographic reach in most of the major services categories. I want to highlight here that our foundation for understanding the telecom infrastructure services market is the nature of the operator spend. And the operator spend is fundamentally driven by capital expenditures and operational expenditures. Here we highlight the total spend that is addressable for the services market based on CapEx, which drives productized services, and that share of OpEx, which is external. This is a very important point because, of course, we all know OpEx has a very large share of operator spend overall, most of which is internal. The trend that we see where we see the inflection point in services becoming an increasing player in the business model for both the operator and the suppliers is a movement of more OpEx spend from the internal services functions of the operator to the external. This, of course, has led to very significant growth in managed services, particularly in 2010 and in years prior. Managed services, as evidenced by network operations for large operators, is a significant foundation of the new movement of services revenue, the new movement of OpEx spend from internal to external. That said, parallel trends that foster the forecast and continue to include or drive capacity growth is the CapEx spend for rollout of broadband access capabilities and broadband networks. And then the major driver of OpEx beyond that, or OpEx spending driving services, is the professional services for initially for things like network optimization to improve efficiency, but then increasingly for transformational kinds of services, which we've highlighted. And that can range anywhere from ways to re-engineer the revenue model for different kinds of tiered billing capabilities to reaching out for M2M and vertical applications, implementing personalization, and even moving towards cloud services models. All of those things create opportunities to grow services beyond the notions of capacity-driven or managed services-driven to above the network kinds of professional services opportunities. And we do highlight also the idea of adding value-add to professional services through building up the consulting portfolio as well, and we'll highlight that. But in general, over the next few years up till 2015, we see a robust market for services and services spend with the OpEx-related services taking on a larger share of the growth after we've completed some of these major capacity builds. As you know, and as those who are new to this will discover, telecom infrastructure services at TBR is segmented into the four major categories of services that we see at a high level. We find this taxonomy is a good way to compare and understand the overall trends in the services space, as well as look at different offerings from suppliers. So we see deployment services with a foundation spend growing through 2015, largely developing based on mobile broadband buildouts and some fixed broadband. We see then the next segment, maintenance services, which is a steady revenue stream for the suppliers and service providers continue to try and push the pricing down on that, but we see steady maintenance services spend regardless. Professional services, it's becoming a much larger share over the course of the forecast period, and then our fourth segment, managed services, similarly claiming an increased share, all of which driven by the trends I've been discussing so far. We see 2012 an inflection point being reached when managed services becomes the largest segment, just by a bit over professional services, driven by the outsourcing and out-tasking operations as the operators increasingly see that they can develop both efficiencies in expertise acquisition and in speed to market by bringing in managed services in various forms for out-tasking or outsourcing from the supplier. Professional services is also highlighted here, which we see is driven both by the deployments and that professional services planning, design, and integration services and network rollout is an important role, as well as mentioned, the transformational kinds of services. So that highlights the key segment trends, deployment being front and center in a lot of the build-out activity right now, ongoing managed services development, and as I mentioned, the professional and maintenance services trends. Here in slide 6, we are looking at a breakout of professional services. We have increasingly worked to build this segmentation more deeply as we have gone forward, because the activity and the opportunity for new kinds of service delivery for professional services continues to grow. It is here highlighting a series of segments that develop over time. We see a strong, steady development of application integration as things like taking advantage of the kinds of revenue opportunities that over-the-top players have taken advantage of, new storefront models, new ways in which to take advantage of cloud, all drive ways the operator wishes to have the the supplier get involved in applications integration, integrating third-party or own-built applications onto the network. Similarly, the BSS build-out continues to be a transformation of BSS to more integrated models with flexible billing services to offer different kinds of personalized billing or tiered billing, as well as being able to incorporate the different kinds of revenue models and new applications drive, some of which cloud models or content-driven services require changes in the ability of the service provider to collect the revenue from that, and that's a change to the billing system. Parallel to that is the change to the OSS, and change to the OSS is more driven by the rollout of new technology. So things like LTE and advanced broadband services require changes in the operational environment for the operator, so we see OSS integration being a major piece as well. And then network infrastructure integration, that essentially is the deployment-driven integration of new products and services into the network with the legacy infrastructure. So that's also growing and is a strong trend. Other services are interesting. Training and security continue to be important, but not high growth markets. They're good individual service segments to target, but they tend to be more part of the requirements of doing business rather than in themselves very high growth areas. In a similar way, so with consulting services, although we see an increasing influence in the consulting service portion of the sell for professional services organizations. We're all aware the operators are facing a great deal of turmoil in deciding how they monetize the capacity builds, how they respond to competition, which technology should they deploy where. all under tight economic circumstances in many cases. So the role of the supplier as a consultant to help resolve or recommend different kinds of business models, starting with what kind of applications will be the ones that receive the best ARPU, drive consulting services. And so the influence of consulting services far outweighs the revenue generated from consulting services. Many times consulting services leads to contracts for transformation, for example. So this is a highlight of the depth of kinds of offerings within the professional services area, driven both by the deployment or capacity build-out factors, so in essence CapEx, as well as the transformational and service layer kinds of initiatives, which is more OpEx related. Next few slides, we're going to look at the regional impact, regional opportunity for different services plays. And here we see the overall regions compared against each other. The three larger aggregated segments of regions are the Americas, EMEA, and Asia Pacific. And clearly, due to the impact of China, India, Asia Pacific continues to be a dominant driver of services revenue, largely tied to product. We see the Americas getting a boost in the middle years, largely because of the broadband build-outs that are taking place. EMEA has been in a challenge environment for the last couple of years, and we can see that continuing, although we see some hope towards the latter part of the forecast where EMEA is going to be increasing in the spend as well. As it suggests here on the slide, we're undertaking a new investment cycle for service providers. By that we mean the investment in higher capacity broadband, mobile broadband, and fixed broadband, the backhaul and the IP network infrastructure that requires. All is a key sign of an investment cycle that we have had over the course of time, and we're seeing a 5-year outlook for that. In parallel to that, what drives these numbers is the ongoing interest in transferring OpEx outside of the organization for managed services, and then also using professional services to a greater degree for some of the transformational work we've talked about. And we see that trend, those sort of trends happening across all regions, some regions faster than others with different profiles, as we've mentioned, and we'll look a little bit more at the regions now. So if we look at the Americas, understand that North America is driven both by a highly competitive environment on the capacity front and on the monetization of subscriber services front. There are high presence of over-the-top players taking revenue out of the stream for the service provider, new mobile platforms driving different interest in data consumption by the subscribers, the competition on the video front between cable and fixed operators, and of course the capacity contest in areas like LTE between the large operators. All these things make for a very strong spending environment despite economic challenges for the North American marketplace. So we have a robust growth 2011-2012 through 2013. Most of the build is going to happen fast for LTE, relatively speaking, so we see by 2014, 2015, some of that capacity-driven spend is going to tail off, and so will, therefore, capacity-driven services spend. The Latin American market, we see more of a spot spend in build-out of capacity and a spot spend in terms of build-out of new kinds of revenue models. There has been an increase, which is built into these numbers, in managed service activity and outtasking in the Latin American market. So there's strengthening, and we expect it to become a more fruitful market in terms of capacity and managed services going forward. So we see a bit of an uptick in the numbers in the later years of the forecast. If we look at EMEA, region breaks out generally into Europe, although Europe has a few different flavors, and the Middle East and Africa themselves with different flavors. we all have experienced that Europe itself has gone through the most severe of the economic challenges and continues, therefore, to have a slow growth profile in services spend. LTE is going in various regions, but certainly not yet universally in Western Europe. Emerging or developing areas of Europe, such as Russia, tend to offer still opportunities for expanded capacity. The most active European trends besides the capacity tends to be experimentation with new revenue models to monetize the user population, as operators who maybe can't afford huge capacity build-outs can look for incremental ARPU through different ways to change their service model to the user. So there's a great deal of activity in professional services, transformational services. Middle East and Africa, a different profile. We are still talking about market expansion, market reach there. Turmoil in the Middle East has mitigated some of that in recent years and will require a little settling. In Africa, we see a low base of spend available, but a high rate of, therefore, supplier financing and a movement into the region to take advantage of what growth there is, a highly competitive set of players vying for the investments that the African and the multinational operators are making to expand coverage in the region. So overall, EMEA provides a strong growth profile over the course of the forecast with a number of different trends in the subregions, and tending in general to say that the mature areas tend to be more fruitful for professional services, while the emerging areas are, of course, more about capacity build and reach, but they tend to be doing so at a lower cost model, which introduces the opportunity for interesting kinds of managed services business models that help the service provider fund some of the cost of the rollout. Next, we're looking at Asia Pacific. Asia Pacific, as I mentioned, has the feature of China and India driving high build, mainly around 3G and eventually around LTE or the TD-LTE. We also have, of course, a quite vast array of economic environments in the Asia Pacific region. We have the mature markets in Australia, where you have operators already well along the way in their broadband capacity build, both fixed and mobile, as well as layering in new applications, much more sort of a North American profile market, where areas such as cloud are getting a lot of attention. And then you have the smaller countries in Asia, which each have their own capacity build challenges and experimentation in revenue models, and then, of course, China and India. Overall, Asia continues to be a really interesting place to play because there's a lot of growth and a lot of experimentation, a lot of willingness to get to a place where some of the European or American markets have taken longer to get to. That is to say, let's try some new things with the end user population to see if we can increase ARPU. Let's try to get capacity done in a quick time market way. There is interest, therefore, in different kinds of business models being deployed by the suppliers, especially around professional services, especially around how do you roll out a to market proposition for capacity build. How do you deploy a new applications model that's going to drive revenue in a rapid time frame? So there's a lot of growth in APAC. It's the largest region for both the product attached and the professional-based services for those reasons. With that, I'll turn the conversation over to Chris Antlis to discuss the supplier view.
Thanks, Mike, and welcome, everybody. So first I'm going to talk about TIS market share. Then we're going to move over to the top vendors by TIS revenue. And lastly, we're going to look at the most profitable TIS vendors by operating margin. Once I finish talking about that, I'm going to turn it back to Mike. He's going to finish up with talking about TBR's methodology and capabilities in TIS. So with that, let's get started here. The global TIS market remains fragmented, and no one firm holds more than 15% market share. As we can see, Ericsson is the leader in the space with the 15% market share. The top 10 vendors control 70% of the market, and the remaining 30% is comprised of a list of Tier 2 and Tier 3 players. Ericsson, Nokia Siemens, and Alcatel-Lucent combined control more than a third of the total TIS market, and all three vendors are involved in both the fixed and wireless sides of the business. They also have, those three firms also have the most extensive services portfolios for the telecom. So with that, we're going to move to the next slide. So the 10 largest TIS suppliers. Again, Ericsson is the dominant player here. In 2Q11, they made over $3 billion in TIS revenue. Nokia Siemens is the second largest. Their recent acquisition of Motorola Networks, which just closed this past April, has given a boost to the company in their services business, and that explains why their growth is so high in this chart you're looking at. Ericsson's been a major participant in the consolidation of the TIS market. Ericsson recently purchased Telcordia and Tridge. Tridge is a BSS company in France. The Ericsson basically is trying to push OSS BSS transformation, and that's going to be a professional service. Ericsson believes that OSS BSS transformation is going to be quite a hot market over the next few years, as operators need to update their legacy billing systems and move from a voice-centric to a data-centric environment. IBM and HP, they're also heavily involved in the telco space, but it's not a primary focus of theirs because both of those companies also focus on other verticals like financial and retail and everything, those other enterprise verticals. So, but still, telecom is on an absolute revenue basis, quite a large portion of their business. And both IBM and HP, they've also been contributing to the consolidation in the space, but they've been making more small strategic acquisitions to bolster their cloud and systems integration capabilities. So they've been a little bit more under the radar, but they are still involved here, and those acquisitions that they have made will show up again in the future, in the near future. Huawei is a rising threat, but the company still remains well behind Ericsson and Nokia Siemens on an absolute revenue basis. So we'll move along to the most profitable TIS suppliers. As we can see in this chart, the most profitable TIS vendors in terms of operating margin tend to include the software vendors and the systems integrators. Ericsson, Nokia Siemens, and Alcatel-Lucent do not rank high on operating margin because they're involved in a broad mix of services with varying margin profiles. So, for example, all three of those firms are involved in the lower margin deployment side of the business, all the way up to the more profitable multi-vendor maintenance side of the business. So, on a net basis, the margin they get from their overall services business is not in the top 10. Cisco, Tech Mahindra, Oracle, Microsoft, SAP, they all rank high because a disproportionate amount of their TIS revenue is from relatively high margin product attached maintenance services. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Mike to finish up.
Okay. Next slide here highlights thank you, Chris. Next slide here highlights the segmentations that we look at for the various services components. So as I mentioned, we look at the top 4 services areas: deployment, maintenance, professional services, managed services. We have a next level view that's based on the subset of services that comprise the segments and are able to understand market position and service provider spend in all these areas. And very important to break out the taxonomy to kind of rationalize all the different plays that are going on in the services market, that it continues to change. And we've reviewed professional services with an in-depth view there. Deployment, of course, broken out between the installation, engineering, and site components. Maintenance, both remote support and on-site support, and then the spare parts management functions. And managed services, it's important to note as you look at these numbers to make sure that you understand managed services is not just network operations outsourcing, it's also out-tasking and hosted services as well. So a significant portion of application hosting, especially as new kinds of applications come into the marketplace. Next, I want just to highlight on how we go about developing our forecast for the market. As I mentioned, it's CapEx-driven and OpEx-driven, and the CapEx portion is basically we disaggregate CapEx into various product categories to determine not only the kinds of services that are being utilized for those product categories, but also which kinds of products are being driven, so the mobile broadband versus the fixed and so on, the many subcategories there. So we analyze the data that is being provided by the revenue that suppliers derive, so the shipments of product. We look at the growth rates of the product attached services there, so there are understandings of how a certain product category is going to play in terms of the quantity of deployment services or maintenance services it will bring into the marketplace. And we have a long-range model of that we've been working with for a number of years. In line with that, we're looking at the overall CapEx spend and segmentation and the way the service providers are investing in their networks as well to get a good view of CapEx and the product spend related to that, and therefore the product attached service spend related to that. On the OpEx side, we do a similar segmentation, have a similar modeling approach to understand the external share of OpEx from our contact with the service providers and our market observations, and then a segmentation of that for how that external spend breaks out between the different flavors of professional and managed services, and understanding the growth rates and activity in the market reflecting that as well. The key part of our process is to do a interview process with both the service providers and the suppliers to align the view they have of what's happening on a real-time basis, quarterly basis, a yearly basis, and build that into our forecast view so that the correlation between our expectations going forward in the model and the actual activity in the marketplace is aligned. So that's sort of a short form of how we come to the forecast model and a way to really come to understand how the spend takes place in the service provider space. Now we're working to find different ways to surface the revenue opportunities for these investments. Clearly you've seen that we can do all kinds of different segmentations. We've chosen a few here as sort of a prepackaged way to give you some views of the segments. One is to break it out regionally, as we've discussed, not just overall Americas, EMEA, or APAC, but those segments based on the subsegments that lie therein, as well as at least our four major services categories on a per regional basis, and an examination of the trends and activities there, and the supplier implementations, who are the top suppliers in market share, as Chris has shown, not just overall, but on a per region and per service basis, is an expanded coverage area that we're offering here for the geographic view. Similarly, we are expanding to a services segment view, and we have selected three of the professional services as the most aggressively developing. In the case of consulting, as I mentioned, it's for its influence and systems integration, and OSS, BSS, I talked about for transformation, and the continuing changing view of managed services where we're seeing new services models for outsourcing, out-tasking, and remote operations being developed. So these are three separate drill downs that also get further split by the subsegments as well as by the key drivers of the demand in those segments and the suppliers being strongest in those segments. We can also look at them on a geographic basis. So this particular look is about them on a worldwide basis on a per service. One of the most interesting aspects here, and we're getting a lot of activity, is the intersection of the IT and the telecom suppliers tends to be in these spaces, as well as applications management, and the fact that there's a lot of jockeying for market share, market position, market growth across these segments as well. So to summarize, we have then a few different ways in which we provide and package this data. As you've seen in the results of the operator work, we have a benchmark. The benchmark looks at 26 of the largest TIS vendors on a worldwide basis, and then looks at the market share for the four major categories and the four major regions. This is our quarterly TIS benchmark. The benchmark is also available to look at on a more deeper drill level on a consulting basis. And as I've showed you, there's some new packaged ideas of how we're looking at that as well. But basically, who are the winners in the market and who are why they're winning, what strategies they're undertaking, what is their profitability, where are they gaining their revenue from, what kinds of services, what kinds of operators, and what regions. And we've been spending most of the time in the presentation on this addressable market forecast, which is our 5-year forecast, looking forward at the opportunity, which segments growing, how fast are they going to grow, and why. We can look at that, as I mentioned, in a number of different slices as well. And as many of you know, we've worked on individual custom projects to take this database and drive it towards whatever taxonomy or opportunity analysis is going to be most useful for the clients, whether it's competitive benchmarking or where should the services investment take place next. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Arnie to close.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Chris, and to our attendees. At this point in time, we will move into the question and answer session. We've collected your questions throughout the session, so let's tackle them now. The first question comes from Kim Jones. She asks, I believe that Kim was telling me that some of this may have been addressed, but I want to make sure we grab this for you, Kim. What split of spending between infrastructure, ergo access, network, 3G, 4G, and coverage, and applications-driven spend, meaning OSS, BSS, and trends, is in the split? And is all this spending by the network operators, or how much is by the internet players?
Wow, a lot of segments in that question. If I understood the question correctly, the best way to answer that is to go back to the professional services slide that was offered there, and that highlights the share of spend per professional services category, which is one way to answer the question. Most of the spend is in professional services is aggregated as software-related spend, so the systems integration work around software. Only really the network infrastructure integration category and planning, design, optimization, some of the spend. So if you just added up applications, BSS and OSS, you would effectively capture the transformational-related integration spend that's going on. So that's one cross-segment way to look at this. The other one, I think, had to do with the kind of product areas, and most of that spend, as highlighted, is mobile broadband and the consequent backhaul and data networking requirements of that. Less so fixed spend, but we can break out the product-attached services by that cut, but that's the other way we might tend to look at it. This does not cover internet players. This covers telecom service providers only. so telecom service providers being a typical mobile operator, fixed operator, or multi-service operator, so your classic BT or AT&T or China Telecom, that kind of company, rather than there's not a Google spend here, there's not a pure internet play spend. Hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you, Michael. Kim, if you need any more detail on that, please address it in Q&A. I appreciate that. The next question comes from Danielle Branco, and this was up in the beginning when we went over the CAPEX, OPEX. She's asking, what is, in general, the percentage of addressable CAPEX and OPEX compared to the total?
CAPEX is 100%. That is to say, capital expenditure, as we measure it, is all on product. For the share on OPEX, it greatly varies by operator, by region, by market. It's less than 20% in general of total, but the percentages are that's just a very gross average. There is a very high OPEX spend, but in some markets and some operators, operator to operator, you get extreme differences. If you look, for instance, at Sprint's externalized OPEX versus, say, Verizon's, the space is quite large. So it really depends, as the operator taking the decision to move to a full outsource or major outsource contract.
Okay, thank you, Michael. One question that came in privately discusses mainly the connection between consulting services. So, in essence, the question is, it appears that consulting services, albeit a smaller revenue portion of the opportunity, plays a major role in unveiling the overall needs of the customer. Can Michael or Chris make a connection between that portion of it, of consulting services, and how it could drive more revenue for the providers? Right.
Well, so I address this when speaking about consulting. That is to say, the share of revenue from consulting is a lot smaller than the share of influence. And by that I mean operators are looking to their trusted suppliers, who tend to be the ones either providing their IT systems or their network equipment, and saying, okay, what do you recommend I do for my business model? How do I monetize the capacity I've invested in? How do I transform my applications environment? There's a lot of choices out there. I mean, a good example is how strongly or deeply do I move into the cloud environment? And the first answer is a consultative answer. What are your business requirements? Where do you want to go? Let's look at your environment, rather than a technology answer. And so it's very important to have a good investment. We've seen suppliers invest more and more in their consulting arms to get there, so they're in the front end of the conversation and don't end up being told that they need to change out a network solution because the consultative conversation that's gone on with another supplier has brought the source of the spend in a different direction. So it's very important to include consulting as part of the service offer.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Appreciate that. I think we have time for one more question that we can address, and there was one there that I need to repeat, so I think Munish had a question, and I'm asking him to repeat it. It didn't come to me, but let's address one question that's related to the verticals, and this comes from Bill Ballway, mainly a suggestion, but Bill states that it might be helpful to mention TIS revenue earned from verticals such as energy, oil and gas, public sector, transportation, utilities, i.e. smart grid, etc. So I'm thinking that certainly Michael and Chris can address that, and let's tackle that one.
Mike, I can take that one if you want.
Sure, Chris.
So, Bill, excellent question. What we're seeing is that the network equipment providers, the TI suppliers essentially, are starting to look for ways to expand their addressable market outside of the traditional telco space. And many of the services that they provide are able to be used in other verticals. So with Alcatel-Lucent especially, they have a segment now called Strategic Industries, and they actually conduct it's a very fast-growing segment within their services business. Other vendors are doing this as well. Ericsson is involved in expanding, in moving to other verticals as well with their services business, as is Huawei and Nokia Siemens, and there's some other TIS vendors as well. TBR does, though the TIS benchmark is more exclusively geared towards the telecom space, TBR is doing research around this new move into other verticals with the traditional TIS suppliers. So TBR has the capabilities to do, custom projects and, research on behalf of any client that would be interested in talking about that topic.
Well, thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. Looks like we're getting close to the top of the hour here. We did have one final question that came in regarding our forecast. So as you know, that we have a very specialized forecast and specific focus in on the telecom infrastructure services world. This comes in from Munish. He basically states that if you look at TBRs compared to other analyst forecasts, ours seems smaller. Do we have a view of the difference and any definitional differences which cause the market size difference?
The answer is yes. Next question. So, of course, it's all about definition. As Arnie mentioned, we have very specific categories we include and a number of categories we exclude. Often, other services forecasts look at service provider spend in its entirety, including IT, and we try and, in fact, work really hard to exclude those IT-related spends. We're really trying to look at the point of view of the telecom service provider and see the kind of services around their product, around their professional services, around their network operations that are reflected in the forecast spend. So you can have a significant market size if you add one or more of the several segments that are pure IT spend. And the way that comes about is many firms look at telecom as just one of the segments that an IT firm just happens to service, and therefore the share of spend that's just telecom gets included in their forecast from an IPT perspective. And we would say we're oftentimes taking a segmentation of that to just refer to that part that's the telecom equipment that a typical telecom service provider would deliver, essentially that a service provider uses to operate their applications and network rather than their own back office and other features. That's the biggest area where I see there is difference. Beyond that, assumptions about growth rates and so on, we closely follow the industry trends and I have seen and worked in situations where it is quite easy to be overly optimistic in forecasting, and that is not a good way to guide the use of these kinds of investments. I would say we tend to be on the conservative side. This industry has seen a lot of changes over the years, and we're always sensitive to the economic environment. So we look very closely at what the real world situation will be so that we can understand it from external factors affecting the suppliers as well as the service providers.
Okay, great. Thanks, Michael. So it looks as if we're running out the hour here, and I know WebEx shuts down automatically. Just wanted to thank everyone for attending. Thanks again to Michael and Chris. As we stated before, we did record today's session, and we will post it to the TBR YouTube channel. Again, if you'd like to watch the presentation again or pass it along to your colleagues. And we will also send out the slides to everyone registered for today's website within 24 hours of the conclusion of the presentation. Should you have any follow-up questions of us, feel free to contact us directly and or your account exec, or any information you need. We are certainly here to help out. And we thank you very much for the time that you spent with us, and hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thank you very much.